May 7, 1945. Camp Rupert, Idaho. For a group of German prisoners of war, the war was over, but a profound and unsettling education was just beginning. The morning sun spilled over endless rows of wheat and alfalfa, shimmering across the high plains. A U.S. Army truck rumbled slowly down a dusty gravel road, its wooden sides packed with weary German soldiers in faded field gray uniforms, their faces tanned from weeks of work under the American sun. The air smelled of diesel, hay, and something almost unbelievable to them, abundance. One of the prisoners, Obergefreiter Hans Moller, stared out through the truck's slats. He had fought hard battles in France and later in Italy, surviving where many of his comrades had not. But he had never, ever seen anything like this. Farm after farm stretched as far as the eye could see. There were massive red barns, glistening silos, and vast machines that looked more like military vehicles than farm equipment. This wasn't the small patchwork farming he knew from home. This was something else entirely, an industry. As the convoy passed, a group of American farmers paused their work, waved, their hands gloved and calloused, faces streaked with sweat. They were feeding pigs, fixing tractors, hauling sacks of grain, and they were smiling while doing it. It was a bizarre, almost surreal sight for men who had only known war and scarcity for years. Inside the truck, a younger prisoner named Dieter whispered in disbelief, his voice barely audible over the truck's engine. "Look at them, Hans. They have more food here for their animals than our entire regiment did." Hans nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. More food and fewer soldiers. The implication hung heavy in the dusty air. Where were all the men? The answer was obvious. They were overseas, fighting. Yet, back home, the country was not just surviving. It was thriving on a scale they couldn't comprehend. The truck finally stopped outside the camp gates. Barbed wire glinted in the sun, a familiar sight. But the place looked nothing like the nightmarish prison camps the men had feared, the kind of places propaganda had warned them about. There were clean wooden barracks, a mess hall that smelled of baking bread, and even a small library. As they disembarked, they were handed something extraordinary: coffee, real coffee, hot and strong, in a tin cup, and with it a thick slice of bread, still warm from the oven. Corporal James Ford, the American guard, smiled politely as he handed each man his cup. "You boys hungry?" he asked. His tone wasn't mocking or cruel, it was just human. Dieter blinked, completely confused by the gesture. "They feed prisoners like this," he stammered to Hans. Hans said nothing, he just looked around, his gaze falling on the American flag fluttering over the camp. Behind it, a massive John Deere tractor rolled across the horizon, tilling a field so wide it seemed to disappear into the haze. Two men who had grown up on small European farms, with rationing, scarcity, and horse-drawn plows as their reality. This scene looked like something from another world. A science fiction novel, perhaps. As the day wore on, the German POWs were assigned to nearby farms to help with the harvest. With so many American men away at war, there was a labor shortage, and the prisoners were put to work. They were given clean work clothes and pointed toward fields already buzzing with the sound of machinery. The first time Hans saw a combine harvester up close, he just stood and stared. The machine was bigger than a Panzer IV tank, its massive rotating blades roaring through the wheat with terrifying mechanical precision, and at the controls, a single farmer, one man, effortlessly doing the work that would have taken an entire German village days, if not weeks, to complete. It was a humbling, almost frightening display of power. At noon, they stopped for lunch. The farmer's wife brought out sandwiches stacked high with meat, cold bottles of milk, and generous slices of apple pie. The Germans hesitated at first, suspicious. Was this some kind of trick, a test? But the Americans, the farmer and his family, sat down and ate right beside them, laughing and talking casually about the weather, the price of corn, and their predictions for next year's crop yield. Hans took a cautious bite of the apple pie. The sweetness exploded in his mouth. He looked at the overflowing barns, the fat, healthy cattle grazing in a nearby pasture, the neat rows of corn stretching all the way to the horizon. And in that moment, he realized something he would never, ever admit aloud to his fellow prisoners. Germany had never stood a chance. The war wasn't lost on the battlefields of Stalingrad or Normandy. It was lost here, in the fertile soil of Idaho, because here, in this quiet corner of America, Hans could see the true engine of Allied power. It wasn't in the tanks, or the bombers, or the battleships, though those were certainly formidable. The real power was in the land, in the machines that worked it, and in the spirit of the people who ran them. This was a nation that could simultaneously fight a global war on two fronts and still produce a surplus of food so vast it seemed limitless. This was a power born not of conquest, but of production. As the sun began to set behind the Rocky Mountains, casting long, dramatic shadows over the camp, Hans sat outside his barracks with a small group of fellow POS. The air was cool and clean. No guards watched them too closely. They didn't need to. None of the Germans were thinking of escape. Where would they even go? More importantly, why would they? The fight had gone out of them, replaced by a profound, sobering clarity. Dieter, the young soldier from the truck, finally broke the silence. "We thought America was weak," he said softly, his voice full of a strange mix of regret and awe. We were told it was a land of decadent consumers, not soldiers, that they had no stomach for a real fight. Hans shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. No, he replied, his voice firm. We were wrong. It's a land of builders, of producers. That's how they won. The other men fell silent, contemplating his words. They watched as the headlights of trucks and tractors flickered across the distant fields. More work, more production, continuing even as darkness fell. The machine never stopped. For the first time since the war began, Hans felt a kind of peace settle over him. It wasn't comfort, and it certainly wasn't forgiveness for what he had been a part of. It was simply understanding. The war had ended for him not with a signature on a document of surrender, but with a quiet realization under a wide Idaho sky. He had seen the future, and it was made of steel, sunlight, and endless fields of grain. June 1945. For a German prisoner of war named Hans, the mornings in Twin Falls County, Idaho, all began with the same sound. The rhythmic drone of engines echoing across endless open plains. Dressed in denim overalls, he and other prisoners stood at the edge of a vast wheat field, blinking in the rising sun. A line of American tractors, like green and yellow metal beasts, was already rumbling to life, their engines coughing plumes of smoke before settling into a steady, powerful roar. Hans adjusted his cap, shading his eyes from the glare. His assignment was with the Benson family, third-generation farmers who worked nearly 2,000 acres of wheat and alfalfa. 2,000 acres, the number was simply staggering. Back in his native Bavaria, his father's farm had been a mere 10 acres, a patch of land they worked with their bare hands and a single horse. A tractor moved past him, a monstrous machine that devoured the field in a way that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. It cut, threshed, and sifted the grain all at once, pouring a golden river into a gleaming bin attached to its side. The driver, a young American man no older than 20, waved and shouted over the noise, "Keep an eye on the chutes. If it clogs, holler." Hans just nodded, his mind still trying to process the scale of it all. It wasn't just the individual machines that left him speechless. It was the rhythm, the seamless coordination of the entire operation. This wasn't farming as he knew it. This was industry. Fuel trucks drove right into the fields to refill tractors on the move, so they never had to stop. Wagons hauled the full grain bins to colossal storage silos that seemed to rise out of the earth like modern-day castles. Even the barns were a world away from what he knew. They were electric-powered, filled with conveyor belts and automated fans, humming with a quiet, relentless efficiency. During their midday break, the farmer, Harold Benson, a man with kind eyes and work-worn hands, handed Hans a cold tin cup. It was filled with iced tea, another small American miracle he'd never encountered before. "You boys ever see a combine harvester before?" Harold asked with a friendly grin, gesturing towards the impressive machines. Hans exchanged a quick glance with his fellow prisoners. He answered in his best broken English, "No, in Germany, we use horse." Harold let out a hearty chuckle. "Hell, we used horses too, back in my granddad's day," he said. "But you know what? Machines don't get tired, and they sure as hell don't eat hay." Just then, the farmer's teenage daughter came around, passing out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, ham, cheese, and thick, juicy slices of tomato. Hans took his carefully, savoring every single bite. The bread alone was softer and more luxurious than anything he had eaten since long before the war began. Across the field, trucks were being loaded with massive bags of wheat. He learned they weren't for the army, or for export. This was just surplus America, simply produced more than it could ever consume. And as Hans would soon realize, it wasn't just about the sheer quantity. It was about the relentless, unceasing drive for efficiency. At night, while the prisoners relaxed in the barracks, playing chess or writing letters home under the dim lights, the Americans were still at it. He could hear them working, the clank of metal on metal as they fixed machines, the low murmur of voices planning crop rotations, the sounds of new irrigation systems being installed. Even in a time of supposed peace on the home front, they operated with the urgency of a nation still at war. But their enemy wasn't another country. Their enemy was scarcity itself. One evening, Hans overheard two American officers talking near the mess hall. "Can you believe it?" one of them said, his voice filled with a kind of casual pride. "Some of these farms out here can feed entire divisions overseas." The other officer replied, "Not just divisions, whole nations." That night, Hans lay awake on his cot, staring up at the wooden ceiling of the barracks. His mind drifted back to Germany. He thought of the strict ration cards, the citywide blackouts, the endless propaganda posters promising a glorious victory through sacrifice and willpower. He remembered the factories back home, desperately trying to build tanks without enough steel, stitch uniforms without enough cloth, and make bullets without enough brass. Here, in the middle of Idaho, every tool, every spare part, every single machine seemed brand new, abundant, and readily available. This was a different kind of strength than the one he'd seen glorified in Berlin. There were no grand parades, no waving flags, no shouting crowds whipped into a frenzy. This power was quieter, steadier. It was a strength built on gears, sweat, and the rich, dark soil of the earth. And in that quiet moment, a profound understanding washed over him. He began to see what the war had truly been about. It wasn't about ideology, or race, or national glory. At its very core, it was about resources. It was about the simple, brutal math of who could produce more, last longer, and feed its people and its armies without breaking. The next morning, Harold offered Hans something he never expected. He let him try driving the tractor. Hans's hands shook slightly as he gripped the large steering wheel. The engine rumbled beneath him like a sleeping beast awakened. "All right, just ease her forward," Harold said calmly, his hand guiding the gear shift. The machine lurched, then rolled smoothly down the furrowed path. The rich earth turned over behind him in a neat, perfect line, for a moment, suspended in the roar of the engine and the smell of the soil. Hans forgot everything: the war, the prison camp, the life he'd lost. He was just a man, taming the land with a powerful machine. This, he thought to himself, is how real empires are built, not with guns and soldiers, but with machines that never rest. When the long day finally ended, Harold came over and patted him on the shoulder. "You've got a real knack for it," the farmer said with a genuine smile. "After all this war nonsense is over, you ought to think about staying here. We could always use hard workers like you." Hans managed a faint smile in return. The idea was tempting, a fantasy he couldn't have dared to dream just months ago. "If I stay," he said softly, the words carrying a weight that Harold couldn't possibly grasp, "I think I will never be hungry again." The American farmer laughed, a good-natured sound that echoed in the fading light. He didn't understand the profound truth in those words, but for Hans, it was no joke. Hunger, and the fear of it, had been the defining story of his entire generation. Standing there, in a land of seemingly endless food and roaring engines, he finally, truly understood why Germany had lost the war. It was August 1945, at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The vast plains shimmered under a blanket of heat. Golden wheat stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of gold touching the horizon. For the German prisoners of war held there, life had found a new, unexpected rhythm. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered, and while these men still wore their khaki uniforms, with the letters PW stenciled in black across the back, the tension that once defined their existence had evaporated. The American Guards still carried rifles, but it felt more like a habit than a necessity. The news had reached the prisoners weeks ago. Hitler was dead. Berlin lay in ruins. Their families, their futures were scattered and uncertain. But the thing that truly struck them, harder than the news of defeat, was the sheer contrast. The contrast between the world they had fought for and the world they were now living in. A German prisoner named Hans watched it all unfold. Every day, trucks rumbled in from nearby farms, hauling loads of wheat and corn that towered over the men who grew it. Convoys of tractors and threshers worked the seemingly endless fields with a relentless, mechanical purpose. And when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the glow of electric lights from distant towns and farms turned night into a soft, artificial day. It was a quiet kind of power, invisible but woven into the very fabric of the landscape. One evening, Hans stood watching a train snake across the horizon, its dozens of boxcars laden with grain. Beside him, an American guard, a friendly kid from Kansas named Miller, took a long drag from his cigarette. "Where's it all going?" Hans asked in his halting English. Miller exhaled a plume of smoke and nodded toward the disappearing train. "Everywhere," he said simply. "Europe, Africa, Asia. Some of it's going back to your people." "You know," Hans blinked, processing the words, "to Germany." "Yeah," Miller confirmed, "relief shipments. Guess we're feeding our enemies now." Those words, feeding our enemies, hung in the warm evening air. Hans looked out at the vast, productive farmland, at the powerful machines now resting like steel beasts under the fading sun. And in that moment, something clicked. It hit him with the force of a revelation. The true scale of American power wasn't just in its weapons or its factories. It was in its staggering capacity to give in Germany. The entire war effort had been about taking resources from neighbors, from conquered lands, from its own people until there was nothing left. But here, in America, victory seemed to mean the complete opposite. Creating, building, and producing on such a massive scale that there was more than enough to go around, even for the very people they had just defeated. Later that night, back in the quiet of the barracks, Hans found another prisoner, a former U-boat engineer named Otto. He needed to know if someone else saw what he was seeing. "Do you see it now?" Hans asked quietly. "Why we lost?" Otto was silent for a long moment, staring down at his rough, calloused hands that had once tightened bolts on the machines of war. Finally, he looked up. "In Germany," he said, his voice low, "we build machines for war. Here they build machines for everything." He paused, gesturing vaguely toward the dark fields outside the window. "We thought the Americans were soft, spoiled. But this," he said, his voice filled with a new understanding, "this is discipline too, just a different kind. The discipline of abundance." Hans nodded slowly. "And it never runs out." Weeks later, the prisoners were taken on a supervised trip to a nearby town as part of a labor exchange program. The sight that greeted them left the battle-hardened soldiers speechless. Store windows overflowed with bread, fruit, and stacks of canned goods. Children walked down the sidewalks laughing and licking ice cream cones. There were no shortages, no ration lines, no pervasive sense of fear. It was just normal life. Inside a general store, a sign caught Hans's eye. It read, "Victory Gardens, tools and seeds in stock." He turned to the guard, Miller a look of confusion on his face. "Even civilians, they farm." Miller grinned. "Yeah, we all did. Everyone planted something during the war. The government gave out manuals, seeds, everything you needed." A wave of dizziness washed over Hans. The idea of an entire nation from generals in Washington to school teachers in small towns mobilizing not just for destruction, but for production, was something he had never conceived of. In Germany, the people had been told to endure hardship, to sacrifice, to make do with less. In America, they had been told to create more. On the drive back to camp later that day, their truck passed a field where two massive combine harvesters worked in perfect sync, moving like synchronized iron giants. Dust rose in silver clouds behind them, illuminated by the sinking sun. Hans leaned against the truck's railing, watching the incredible display of efficiency. "It's strange," he said softly, almost to himself. "In Germany, we built weapons to conquer the world. Here, they've built machines that can feed it back at the camp as the men prepared for their final harvest before being sent home." Hans looked at the American machinery with a new sense of reverence. It wasn't envy he felt anymore, but a profound understanding. He realized that the ultimate weapon of America wasn't its army, or its bombs, or even its vast wealth. It was its efficiency. An efficiency born not from top-down commands, but from a democratic spirit from millions of free people choosing to build, to innovate, and to improve, rather than simply to obey. The following spring, when Hans finally returned to the shattered Germany, he carried no souvenirs, no photographs. He brought back only a single, powerful image burned into his memory, a horizon filled with tractors, their engines roaring like thunder, cutting through fields that stretched on forever. For him, and for thousands of other German prisoners, that vision marked the true end of the war. Not on a battlefield, not in a surrender document, but in a simple wheat field, under the vast American sun. It was there they understood not just how they had lost, but the nature of the power that had defeated them, a power built on creation, not destruction.
Advanced amino formula, efficiently used by the body. Scientifically designed to deliver essential amino acids with almost no waste. Now, for a limited time, get 60% off just for you. Advanced Bionutritionals. Smart.
In the spring of 1946, a ship creaked into the port of Bremen, Germany. On board were men like Hans, former prisoners of war returning to a home they no longer recognized. They stood at the rail, the cold wind a sharp reminder of the chilling uncertainty that lay ahead. This wasn't the Germany they had left. The nation of warriors was gone, replaced by a nation of survivors. As Hans stepped onto the dock, the scene was one of utter devastation. Cities were blackened husks, the air thick with the smell of smoke and dust. Children scavenged in the ruins for scraps of wood, his stomach turned. Along the pier, Red Cross trucks handed out thin loaves of bread in cans stamped U.S. Army rations. The irony was bitter. The food keeping his people alive was grown on the same American farms where he had labored as a prisoner. His old friend Otto, from their time in a Nebraska camp, managed a small smile. "You see, even here, it's their tractors feeding us." Hans nodded, chewing the coarse, dry bread. "It's not the tractors," he said quietly. "It's the people behind them." They walked through the shattered streets of Bremerhaven, past eyes that had forgotten how to hope. The war was over, but desperation was a constant companion. The black market thrived in the shadows of bombed-out buildings, where cigarettes were traded for soap and shoes for potatoes. Yet, amidst this despair, whispers began to circulate, whispers of rebuilding, of something called the Marshall Plan. America again, always America. Weeks later, Hans found work with a reconstruction crew near Hamburg. The labor was grueling, clearing rubble brick by brick, but with every stone he lifted, his mind went back to Nebraska, to the endless fields, the steady rhythm of engines, the feeling of creation, not destruction. At night, gathered around a small fire, he and other former POWs shared their stories. They didn't talk about battles or strategy. They talked about what they had witnessed in America. Carl, who'd been in Iowa, spoke with a kind of awe. "You should have seen their barns," he'd say, "cleaner than a hospital. And the machines. They could harvest more in a day than our entire village did in a month." Another man, Franz, had been in Oklahoma. "Even the children worked," he recalled, "but they smiled doing it. No fear, no Gestapo, just pride in what they were doing." Hans listened, a slow realization dawning on him. It wasn't their guns that won the war, he said, looking at his own calloused hands. still tanned from the American sun. It was their fields, their spirit. He paused, the weight of his words settling over the small group. If Germany ever rises again, he continued, it won't be through conquest. It will be through work, through building, just like they do. In the years that followed, those words became a prophecy. By the early 1950s, a miracle began to unfold in West Germany. American aid tractors, grain, machinery, fuel poured into the country, and at the forefront of this incredible rebirth were thousands of men just like Hans, men who had seen the blueprint of American productivity with their own eyes. They didn't just rebuild what was lost, they built something new, something better. Hans became a foreman on a farming cooperative outside Hanover. The fields were small and the soil was heavy with neglect, but he remembered the American approach to every problem, not with despair, but with methodical determination. He saved every mark he earned, eventually buying a second-hand tractor which he shared with the neighboring farms. Slowly but surely, the hum of engines replaced the silence of ruin. Within 5 years, his village wasn't just feeding itself, it was exporting wheat. One afternoon, a British officer on an inspection tour stopped to admire the lush fields and the orderly rows of crops. "You've done well here," the officer remarked. "Impressed?" Hans offered a faint smile, his gaze sweeping over the land he had helped bring back to life. "We had good teachers," he replied. He wasn't talking about generals or politicians. He was thinking of the Kansas guardsman who taught him how to fix a carburetor, the Nebraska farmer who showed him how to read the clouds to predict rain, the American children who, instead of shunning them, waved to the prisoners through the barbed wire fences. It was this invisible exchange, this simple act of shared humanity that had outlasted the war itself. It was a lesson more powerful than any weapon, a foundation more enduring than any fortress. Years later, when his son would ask him about his time in captivity, Hans wouldn't speak of the hunger, the fear, or the punishment. He would simply say, "I saw a country that didn't need to conquer the world, because it could feed it." And in that profound, quiet truth, he found not only peace, but a kind of redemption. This is a story that reminds us that some wars are not won by soldiers, but by farmers, and sometimes the greatest victories are sown in fields of humility and hope. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the hidden corners of our shared history. We'll see you in the next one.